All right. Hello, everyone. So in today's video, we're doing round three of ABP 2023. For the purposes of this debate, life-extending treatment refers to medical interventions that prolong the duration of life without curing the underlying medical condition. Examples include dialysis, mechanical ventilation, and clinically assisted nutrition. And the motion is this House believes that countries with public healthcare systems should not subsidize life extending treatments for the elderly or those with terminal illnesses. And I will note that we were closing opposition in this debate. It was quite a good room. And I remember in prep time, um, I was quite, quite indeed, um, unsure about what argument I would want to prioritize. Like in prep time, I remember vividly discussing that do we want to make this a debate on um a philosophical one that's about like our obligations? Do we have an obligation to extend the life of the elderly and those with terminal illness? Or do we want to make this a debate on like what is the actual cost of this into the public healthcare system, and how does this compare against the other costs that many individuals and families would face as a consequence of this? Well, because I already knew in my speech I wanted to run an argument on, people like families, people will still want to pay for that life extending treatment regardless, because um they care about the elderly, they care about their family, like it's a moral obligation they know that they have, and so people will pay that regardless. And so I had the decision to either shift towards into a deeper moral obligation point, which might be taken by opening up, or do I shift towards into an overly obsessive economic argument, which was to say that, the private healthcare system is very, very, very exploitative, and absent public subsidy, this would be worse for a lot of people. And then implicitly within the argument, that is why the state must intervene to subsidize life extending treatment. So just to set up how the debate was going on at this point, so opening government goes in and provides, of course, a lot of very, very good and reasonable arguments to explain that states should not waste money on this, that there are a lot of other priorities that they have, that there is no additional meaningful utility, or at least it is diminishing in utility to always extend the life of someone that has a terminal illness, or of the elderly, and that is why, compared to other priorities of the state, this is simply less important. And opening up actually runs definitely a lot of arguments on why we still have an obligation to them, and why we definitely should beat out and I want to point out, they already explain here that there's some level of monopolization from the private sector, and that is why this is already very, very bad for a lot of people, because the costs are super, super high. So opening up is already talking about the urgency, why we need to subsidize it, why it's quite bad for a lot of people. Opening gov already runs the priorities of the state argument, and opening up does respond to all of this very, very well as well. And so at closing up, definitely I had the critical decision point to either just like, am I gonna double down on the economic intricacies argument more, or am I going to explain the moral obligation argument a little bit more? And I do remember that at this point in the debate, I did want to find a way to do both, and I wanted to balance both of those considerations, because I didn't want to be boxed out with another like weird economic argument that might not always sell anyways. And so I wanted to both be emotional and very passionate in building the moral obligation argument more than what opening up did, like engage in a more hardline way to OG. And I also wanted to build the monopolization argument in a more sophisticated, detailed way, in the way that I know how. And so that's why I wanted to really win on this metric. Like I really just like out demonstrate them on those particular two issues, and then win on that metric. So yeah, no, let's get right into the speech and see how that performs. So that's the context. OG does that type of contextualization. OO responds in the way that to build this urgency and to build the monopolization and cost argument. And of course, closing gov also tries to extend on the obligation point, and attempts to um explain the priorities of the state as well. So it's quite clear that I have to respond to the obligation point at some point. So I wanted to try and destroy this at the start and immediately with the framing. So let's just see how it turns out. Public healthcare system thrives on the social goods created from a healthier population because the costs that states otherwise would have shouldered are recouped by the provision of public healthcare. This is the clearest formulation of our moral obligation to others and our obligation to the common good. At closing opposition, our win condition is going to be clear. If we can show that they cause a market vulnerability in the healthcare system by failing to provide for life-saving treatment, then we can win because their public funding system collapses. My argument is simple. Okay, now I remember I now remember how I merged this problem together. Oh, that's fantastic. I'm very, very happy about this actually. The way I tried to merge those two problems, the moral obligation and the private economic argument, the predatory argument, is that I wanted to say that if states don't subsidize these people who are paying for life extending treatment, then the public healthcare system would still collapse because everyone is paying so much excessive money to the private healthcare system that their finances collapse, and that they also overwhelm the public healthcare system anyways if you don't pay for this treatment early on, because it's gonna get worse and worse if if the families are incapacitated, and all of these people with terminal illnesses are also further incapacitated because of the inability for them to pay off a lot of these debts. So I think that's quite a creative way actually. I'm very, very happy about that as well. So I think doing this at the beginning is quite helpful. I remember that when I was giving this introduction, it wasn't clearly communicated that much because, of course, I'm adding so many clauses into the sentences. But I definitely do need to get into the argument immediately here. It'll be layered later, but the argument label is this. It is necessary to combat predatory private healthcare practices or risky alternative healthcare options that are induced by their public option that is taken away on their side. Before this, 2 points of response to Gov. Number one, do we have a moral obligation to subsidize one's twilight years? OG's case is contingent on the usage of one's life, which is how much they exhausted their life relative to others, and closing government's argument is based on the quality of that life. So my response is going to use utility as their metric. Assuming utility is a metric, allow me then to demonstrate and fill in the gap by saying that the twilight years of one's life is inextricably linked to the good of others. The elderly, for example, have forged deep... Okay, so I think this is... I wouldn't say this is a throwaway attempt at dealing with the moral obligation point. I just really like this idea, just to say that and go a bit hardline and say that the old people are good for society. I really double down on that to just say that old people are great. We have a moral obligation to them, even using the metric of OG and CG, which is my attempt at beating out the obligation point that OO was giving earlier when they were responding by saying that, we shouldn't be very transactional and be very like utilitarian. So OO responds by saying that it's about, it's not about utility. And then I say, even if it's about utility, like old people are good. And then I'm very happy about these creative responses. I think I overdid it, but it's perfectly fine at this point. Deep social connections, meaningfully coloring the lives of individuals in their people and in their community in ways in which we cannot comprehend. Think of the deepest forms of grief that one individual feels, that one's family members feel when they fail to fulfill their obligation to their own parents, the obligation that they've had when they were incapacitated when they were young. Parents who grow to be old, who lose their capacity to think, and suddenly lose public funding on the basis of the fact that their family cannot pay for them. Think of the financial burden it creates, the emotional
emotional burden and the toll it creates towards the individuals, ones in which that multiply over and over again because of something that we call love, an unconditional capacity that states cannot comprehend, in which the cultural value of allowing people to die on their deathbeds in a moral way is also something that is morally salient on our side. The fact that we make a society on our side that we say that they've lived so long, the fact that they've lived so long, they say it means there's less quality of a life that you should support. The fact that they've lived so long means that you have the value in itself that is assigned to the dying process. And that is why our obligation is fulfilled. At the point in time, we fulfill the obligation to the dead and the obligation we fulfill to the elderly in particular, because of the fact that we have this utility that is inextricably tied to others, that is one that is linked to that reputation. So the example here is that states subsidize public cemeteries for that same reason. We think this is also a public good that is also derived directly from life-saving treatment, because it means more hours, more days, more weeks to spend with your loved one, to have the cultural value of dying and being able to die well with your family. Number two.
Okay, no, I mean, to be fair, this response is fine. I think that I really love the part where I'm building momentum into going into the emotional, passionate building of like why like there is dignity in dying well and there is dignity in caring for someone in their deathbed. I really love that part. I love those moments when I get into that type of rhythm. I like exploring that part of my speech as well on these particular instances. But just on a logical level, I think it's also quite important that I gave the analogy at the end and the conclusion that it is inextricably tied to the good of others. Because at some point, I think I was also just asserting that there is value in life so long as it is deeper and as long as you spend more years in it. And then, of course, Closing Gov, OG are gonna just respond by saying that, no, but, like, other things are more important. And so I didn't want to just leave it at that. I think definitely it's quite important that I said that other people's good is something that is mediated by the good of the state. And I also could have probably added something related to that. But for the purposes of dealing with the opening exchange on moral obligation, I do think this is perfectly fine. Like I had to stop this and then move on to the next argument and next idea immediately.
On closing government and the cost of palliative care. If they want the numbers game, then we do the numbers game. Private systems and the cost of palliative care get significantly raised in their model because the capacity for private corporations, big pharma in particular, to extract rents from patents and through the private insurance system that is also relatively more monopolistic on their model. And here's why we resolve it with subsidies. Subsidies resolve this because you collectivize public funds under a public institution to be able to pool resources together and generate scale economies to the ability for you to provide more life-saving treatment centers on the basis of prioritization for many of these individuals that are needed of that care. So we reduce the uncertainties created on their model, because the more people fear that their family will not be able to get life-saving treatment and the payments for that, then the more financially burdened they are on their side, and therefore all the costs of care become worse for them.
Okay, yeah. So actually, this second response is very convoluted. I'm trying to do a lot of things at the same time. And to be fair, I actually think I'm still correct with the way that I phrased it. I just think that in terms of a communication perspective, I think if you try to overwhelm your response by adding way too much stuff, like doing the scale economies, showing that subsidies are good because states make it less expensive than before, and that this is better than the uncertainty of like not knowing whether funding is gonna happen, and so no one wants to deal with this like public goods dilemma. I think for me, I understand that initially. It's quite clear to me that there is an insufficiency of funding there, but for the purposes of communicating it effectively to like most judges or to all judges, or even just communicating it like just giving the argument justice, I should have parsed it a little bit better, or just do it in the argument itself. Like I should have just done this in the argument. I definitely just wanted to add in the response because I felt that I would be accused of not responding explicitly to closing government. So I just added this anyways, and then that's why I move and shift into the argument itself. To be fair, this time management is perfectly fine because right now I'm at 3:30 or something like that. I only have one big argument here, and this is quite critical that I have to really do this argument very, very well at this point and build the mechanisms from that. So let's see how this happens from here.
The argument, let me cook. First argument on why it's necessary to combat predatory private healthcare provisions or any alternative healthcare options that are more risky in their model. Impacting first. If we can demonstrate that private healthcare will exploit this market failure, then it is necessary for the state to intervene to alleviate the way in which it is significantly shouldered or in which the state would have otherwise shouldered these public harms directly caused from predatory private systems. This is uniquely independent of the moral worth of old people because our argument is it is a precondition for the existence of a healthcare system that people are able to function financially because the way in which they will be crippled on their model is substantially worse for many of these families. There are three reasons as to why the private system is inherently more exploitative for terminally ill patients. Number one, information asymmetry is caused when a few pharmaceutical companies are able to be more dominant in the market, relatively more monopolistic against the state and relative to the state or the existence of a public option. Competition is inherently not fair because of the possibility of tacit collusion and the fewer individuals in the market to be able to bargain against contractors. Number two, because the patients have inherently, and the families in particular, inherently have an infinite valuation to the preservation of life because it's either they're living or they're not living, therefore they will always pay for any upfront cost, then it is inherently more likely that insurers and providers can jack up prices in a very unaccountable way. But lastly, because of the urgency of time and the unavailability of public palliative care, like we need to delay it, make it longer and longer and longer. The reason as to why time is important is because they are relatively more vulnerable and prone to opting in for more experimental treatments that are provided by pharmaceutical companies. Again, this exists in the status quo, but it becomes even more predatory in the world in which the public option does not exist because the urgency is more exponentiated, it becomes faster, the timeline is closer because they're dying, you need a life-saving treatment now, or you either go for this treatment now, and therefore the urgency becomes more exploitative for a lot of these families. Think of the fact that if you're a family member and you're on a deathbed, you have to do anything that you want to do for your family member. That's why it matters, and that's why our moral obligation argument and our resolution works in our side. Like, think of the fact that Medicare being excluded for pre-existing conditions, when it excluded that in the United States, it simply jacked up prices for a provision of all healthcare because it made it harder and harder for you to pay for those expenses. OG.
Your attempt to wash out the UTAL case also applies to the 10-5-year-olds who died to dengue.
Yes, no. Like, if I wash out the utility case, you have to make it approximate to the healthcare costs that are created and the way in which a public option either alleviates or worsens that cost. Our argument is it alleviates this cost in a simple way. It creates a public option that is cheaper because the necessity to profit.
I'll just point out that so two things I'm gonna point out right now at this point. The first thing I'm gonna point out is that in the actual argument, I will admit that I am spamming a lot of economic jargon and mechanisms as a means to try and be a little bit more specific as to what the root of private capture looks like. So I'm saying that, you know, you do not know when your elder person is gonna die, which is why, you know, it's likely that you'll be exploited more for the fact that you're so compassionate and caring of your old person. And it's also the fact that, you know, because of this urgency, you're willing to opt in for like the highest costs for like experimental treatment no matter what, because, you know, you're gonna do no matter what to save your elderly parent, etc., etc. To be fair, that's essentially basically what I'm saying. I'm saying it in many ways that, like, companies will do this together, they will collude in doing this together, and that it's easier for you to be targeted for this, and that's why you're gonna pay for a lot of this all the time, and then that is why it's a direct cost to you. I will admit though that I still am very happy that I doubled down on building a lot of these mechanisms part by part as to where the information comes from, because I knew that if I opted in to just say that there is just monopolization, that the private healthcare is just very expensive in general, then the POI becomes more persuasive. Like, the POI that was just raised to me becomes a little bit more persuasive because they just say that, all of the other people that could have otherwise used this money, right, can still be prioritized. Like, think of all of those diseases, etc., etc. And so that is why I think my response becomes a little bit more effective here, because I'm saying that there's a balancing problem that's going on. That it's either you care about those people who should be prioritized, but that argument only makes sense if you demonstrated that the costs that are alleviated when the state subsidizes is also a life-saving cost. And that's why I'm very happy to still make that the bottom line of the argument. Like I think that is the exceptional part of the argument. The fact that I'm saying that this is a cost that is eventually shouldered by the state. That it's so bad because these families are paying so much. That's a burden that the state should care about in the same way that they care about those people dying of malaria, etc., and all those other diseases. So that's basically the way I'm responding to. That's why I think it sells very well here, and that's why I think like jointly responding to the obligation point and the private insurance point works very well in this instance because they're really tied in terms of that cost efficiency explanation that the debate is playing on at this point.
Is not as perverse, it is relatively public accountable, and it so has an incentive, and the state usually has an incentive to charge lower so that these families can still function well after because they have an incentive for them to continuously function and to vote in the next election and to stay in power for all those reasons. Optionality for these families is good, the guarantee is good because your model inherently creates a model in a hole within a public healthcare system that makes it harder for them to pay for healthcare expenses for anything else, especially if they are going to pay for the infinite cost of saving their family, saving their dad, saving their mom, saving for all these things. So you cannot make this debate a utility debate because the incredible burden that is most approximate is the family financing burden that is directly caused from families that will have someone that is terminally ill in their family, someone that is going to be incapacitated. And when you incapacitate even their family members, that is only the state that can intervene, and that is exactly why our economic argument wins.
Yeah, no, so what I'll say here is that I'll say a few things just to wrap up my review of this particular debate. The first is that I think it's quite good. Definitely a good strategy to jointly respond to the moral obligation point, value of the elderly, while explaining the private capture point to the extent that it exhausts the state's the why to the extent that it is a burden that the state would shoulder anyways, and more so on gov. So I'll show this on the screen. Yeah, no, definitely. I think it's quite important that I'm jointly trying to tie these facts together. And I also want to note the second thing. This is also very important that in an argument that is essentially a vertical extension to like very to arguments that are very intuitive, right? So the arguments that already came out in the debate are quite simple, right? Like subsidy makes something cheaper, private costs are more expensive, states should not subsidize something that is very expensive, and that states have an obligation to care about other things for other people, blah. Right? These are all arguments that are so clear, so intuitive. They will be repeated a million times in the opening half, no matter what. So my strategy, it's a good strategy to be very effortful with how these costs manifest, what their sources are, and to also add in a lot of illustrations that psychologically prove these claims. So like the info asymmetry, the compassion point, etc. So I definitely think these are quite important parts that I was doing in this speech in particular, just to outweigh the debate and to really just distinguish my own argument. Admittedly, I know that there's not much else to say. I can't, I even now I still can't think that much else to add to the debate that was already existent. But because I mean, if I only focused on the elderly have value point, then it's not gonna be enough for sure. But if I only focused on like the subsidy and scale economies point, then that's never gonna win me for sure. But if I had to really win this debate, I had to tie these issues together and play along with where the sources of these costs get alleviated more. And so that's why opted for the strategy where I'm doing both at the same time. And trying to bring in this weighing mechanism, the centralizing weighing mechanism of, oh, states shoulder this burden at gov more, and that's why you have to compare these costs in this way, and you're comparing costs wrongly in your side, and that's why I'm doing it for this debate. Okay, that's very much it. Thanks guys. Have a wonderful day and enjoy.